أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to the After Maghrib podcast wherever you are listening around the world. Today we're going to be talking about the forthcoming election in the United Kingdom, but more broadly the state of affairs that are concerning Muslims in the West. Whether you're in the UK or the USA, of course this is a year where you have groundbreaking and really defining elections coming up in your country, and we feel that this is a really prime opportunity to discuss how Muslims engage politically and really whether we're doing justice to ourselves in representing ourselves and our views in a political system which we expect to represent us. So in order to do that, inshallah, we are going to have a really comprehensive discussion. It doesn't matter where you live, brothers and sisters, but this is a conversation which you need to be a part of. So if you're not in the UK, don't stop listening. Make sure you continue to listen because this will affect you in some way, shape or form. Before we introduce our special guest, I am delighted to introduce a co-host by the name of Sayyid Aliraza. Assalamu alaikum, Sayyid.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How's it going?
Alhamdulillah, I'm well.
Yeah.
Yourself?
Yeah, I'm good. Alhamdulillah. How are you feeling about today's conversation?
I'm feeling politically unwell.
Unwell?
If that makes sense, yeah.
How so?
Like, when it comes to politics and just based on my life and how I see governments and political parties, it's very clouded. I feel like they just talk nonsense. Like, growing up, politics meant nothing to me. But given like the recent events happening, the atrocities we see in the Middle East, on the people of Palestine and Gaza in particular, that has made me want to get more involved in politics.
Okay.
In terms of, with my vote, make a change on how the UK foreign policy will be. So that's what I mean by politically unwell. Like, I want to vote, but is there any hope in voting? But perhaps we can get into that.
I think that's a conversation which a lot of us are probably having internally. And I know obviously when we put polls out on After Maghrib, we had hundreds, and thank you guys, we had hundreds and hundreds of responses.
We did.
And we'll get into the conversation that we had with the audience before this was recorded. But to help us navigate the conversation, very delighted to introduce Aliraza Manji. Assalamu alaikum, Aliraza.
How are you?
I'm good. Alhamdulillah, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good. Why don't, for those who don't know you, why don't you tell everyone about yourself, what you do?
I am a journalist. I work for Times Radio as a producer and as a political reporter. So I do a bit of show producing, basically.
Yeah, a bit of show producing. For Andrew Neil, of course, for those who don't know, is the most, definitely one of the largest, if not the largest political voice or commentator in the UK. So you do incredible work, and obviously you're an expert. For a lot of people who see the work of Muslims in the media, maybe a question which I think a lot of people may have is, what is your end goal? What's your personal end game?
I mean, for me, I've always had an interest in pursuing politics to wherever it takes me, because politics for me didn't start on October 7th. Politics for me has been there throughout my childhood. As far as I remember, my first political memory was 2010 at the election debate, the first election debate, Nick Clegg, who then was declared the next day, famously by the Telegraph, the most popular man in Britain since Winston Churchill. So that's my first political memory. And that has been a thread throughout my life in wanting to improve things, wanting to contribute. And journalism is a vehicle in that sense to be able to hold those who, we feel sometimes don't answer the right questions, don't actually work for us sometimes. And make them answer the questions that we want them to answer, really. And
today we have the opportunity to ask someone in the media the questions that we want to ask. That's always it.
Smooth.
We've got a nice opportunity to ask.
Indeed.
So I know off camera you and me talk a lot about the thoughts of people, and definitely about, especially on the podcast over the last few months.
Yeah.
Goes without saying, we've tried to include the genocide in Gaza as much as possible. I think this is a good place to start because it affects everyone. We all have strong views on it. What do you reckon, Sid?
I reckon we all do. Number one, the fact that we're Muslim, we sort of resonate with what's happening in Gaza even more, I think, than any other faith group that's out there. But just before I speak about Gaza, when I first thought about voting, it was just to get a mobile phone contract, because I remember going to 3 back at that time. They didn't give me a contract, and they were like, maybe if you vote, you go on the electoral roll, you'll be able to take out a mobile phone contract. So politics was nothing to me. But as I said earlier, I'm politically unwell. And and I think everyone watching and listening, we are a Shia Muslim podcast. This means the world to us. Not just to me, my family, my friends, my community, and the people I see online, what they're saying, what they're speaking, what I'm reading, even people who are not even involved in politics have now want to understand how they as Muslims can make a change to ease the plight of Palestinians.
Hold on, guys. Before you go any further with the conversation, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have some exciting news to bring you, and that is that After Maghrib is now partnering with Thaqalain Media to bring you the best media in the Shia world. Everything from news, stories, articles, calendars, series, guides, and all sorts of content. For example, today I was on the Thaqalain app and I was reading an article about 5 things to learn from Imam Rada alayhi salam, and that's really what it is. It's about connecting the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt as guides for our day-to-day life. So guys, I encourage everyone to download the Thaqalain app. You can also watch After Maghrib on there as well. I highly recommend it. The amount of series on here is incredible, and not just to download the app, brothers and sisters, but also to very easily support Thaqalain. It's really important that we support the community work that they're doing and be able to give back to them. Make sure you download Thaqalain right now. Don't delay. Pause this video, download Thaqalain, and now you can enjoy the conversation.
Is there a chance for us as Muslims to help shape foreign policy in the Middle East?
I think there's been an awakening is what's happened. I think most people can go out through their lives, and as you say, you did, and they can probably ignore what happens in number 10. Most people can go ahead. They don't care who enters through number 10. That's not for us.
Yes.
That's for them, and that's not for us. Most people can live that life, and they can fully accept that that's the case. And therefore, elections don't matter. And to some extent, this election will be all about apathy. I think apathy will be the real winner here. But I think Gaza has shown to the Muslim population there are issues which count more than any other. There are issues that count for us, and they are issues that matter to us. And so, I mean, there was a recent poll that said 80% of Muslims would put this in their top 5 issues. Gaza. And they didn't necessarily say that they're different from the British public. They didn't say that they're going to vote. The NHS wasn't a key issue for them, for example, or any other key issue. But they did say Gaza was one of the contributing factors. It's why they've taken up to the streets. It's why every 2 weeks we see millions of people on the streets of London, Paris, Berlin, across the world. You're seeing millions of people taking up placards, walking through. It's a global cry. It's a global cry, and I think that that's the shift we're noticing. Is that Muslims previously could feel, I wouldn't say they were taken for granted. I wouldn't go that far. I would say that Muslims were pretty content to continue supporting certain parties. In the UK, it's Labour mostly. They were pretty content with where things stand. They're no different from any other voter. What the response to Gaza from governments, especially Western governments, in certain Muslims' eyes, has been basically quite slow. And when you feel like you're not being listened to, that is when people have sort of taken to the streets. And yes, you do get a minority of people who come across as more extreme than others. That is the nature of all demographics. But it is the reason why people are on the streets.
So it's interesting. Obviously, there's Muslims. I feel like I have a lot to say. So I feel like today you're going to hear me unload a bit as well. But it's frustrating because we cry and shout about underrepresentation or even Islamophobia in both of the major parties, or in even in, of course it goes without saying, but innately in the Reform Party as well, which is now back in the news again. But when we talk about Muslims in politics, what drives me crazy is that we aren't representing ourselves, and that's a huge conversation to be had. One may argue that it's too little too late now for a Muslim to run in politics or to run for office, because you may say that the parties, some may say, are innately Islamophobic. Some may disagree, of course. Some may say that both parties, especially in the UK, Labour and the Conservatives, or Tories as we'll call them a lot today, are pandering towards far-right opinions, which are Islamophobic or anti-immigration or whatnot. Many people will also say that Islamic values actually represent the best of British values, because you talk about contribution to civic society. Muslims are there. You talk about entrepreneurship. Muslims are at the forefront of business in the UK. You talk about charitable contributions. Muslims are the most charitable people in the UK statistically.
Family values,
Family values
yeah,
as well. Literally, family values that was like a key point as well. There's so many things which Muslims do to contribute to society. Why are Muslims not? We'll come back to Gaza because I think that's very important. But especially in this election, why are Muslims expecting to be heard, but not actually putting themselves at the forefront of the conversation as well?
I
Running for office.
think for a long time, Muslims have been involved. We've never been uninvolved as a community. Since my parents came to this country in the 1970s, so they've been involved. They've voted. They've done their duty, I suppose, democratically. They've always believed in voting. And I wouldn't say that they're not going to read a party manifesto cover to cover.
Yeah,
but they do care about who enters and who leaves. And so I think what's changed in some sense, and why we're seeing that change now, is that politics for some people is that it's a sidestep. It's not natural to us. It's not natural, I think, for a lot of people to want. You have to have a hell of an ego. I have to have an ego to come here, but you have to have a hell of an ego to want to go and enter politics. Put yourself out there like nothing else. Your entire life is under a microscope. And so I think for a lot of people, they haven't wanted to do that until there was an issue that really mattered, that they felt that they could own. And we are seeing Muslims come out now in a way that we haven't seen previously.
Because I think that the conversation on Gaza, like you said, has been an awakening, I think, for a lot of Muslims. And with that awakening has come two questions. One is, should I be involved? And the second is, how much should I be involved? So if I am involved, does it stop at a protest at Marble Arch, or does it go further to vote for an independent candidate, or even further to run as an independent candidate, or even challenge one of the other major parties for what they're doing, and scrutinize candidates there as well? Because Gaza, I think, is such a key point, and I think a lot of people want to know, and maybe you can help us understand, not just in the UK but also in the US as well. Why are the major parties not seeing light, and why are they not understanding that it's a political gamble to risk the Muslim vote, especially when they know Gaza is such a key issue, and that, like, especially by not taking the strides that Muslims expect forward when it comes to the ceasefire calls, and when it comes to calling for humanitarian aid, or using the word genocide, or even plausible genocide. Why is that not a case which we expect?
I think there's an element. I mean, if you look at the Democrats in the US, the GOP, here you look at the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, they're all pretty much towing along the same line, roughly, when it comes to this. We haven't seen a massive differentiation, and as positions change, they tend to go together.
Yeah.
The UK, I mean, as far as I can remember, has voted about 3 times or abstained 3 times at UN Security Council resolutions when it comes to Gaza. And I think when it comes to the Muslim, there are 4 million Muslims here in the UK. Of voting age, probably half that maybe.
Yeah.
And so the impact we have as a community in some sense is not massive. If someone doesn't listen to us, it's not going to inherently change the result sometimes. But it is noticeable when it is noticeable when people are starting to amalgamate, come into areas, and you sort of see the ability of these independent candidates, as you say, or even people running in certain areas trying to de-seat other people. You start to see the impact of the Muslim vote, and that's not been seen before. I mean, I'm going to give you an example. You will know this anyway. The West Midlands mayoralty, which was run for about just a month ago, basically.
Yeah.
There were 43,000 votes for Ahmed Yaqub. He was an independent candidate, and you'd expect that in the current national trajectory to be a pretty easy Labour take. And it didn't. They won almost by just about 1,000 votes. And that was because the independent candidate took pretty much all of Birmingham. He took pretty much all the votes of Birmingham. Now, Birmingham, we know here, is pretty much a heavily Muslim populated area. And so there you are seeing the full-on impact of the Muslim people coming together and voting on the issues that they care about.
Because, I mean, you said that there may not be a massive shift made by the Muslim vote, but over 100 seats in Westminster are affected by the Muslim vote. And it's interesting because a lot of the blue seats, the Tory seats in the UK, actually don't have a large Muslim population. But it's actually in a lot of those safe Labour seats, like you said, in the West Midlands, where Labour can be hurt by Muslims voting otherwise. because, and a lot of it, like you said, it comes back to Gaza, and Gaza is such a key issue. But say it as a voter, and obviously this is like, I don't want to give away your age, but what, like your fourth election?
I'm 32.
Yeah, so your fourth election or something like that, right? So yeah. So based off this, yeah, what do you expect from the parties as a voter? Like, what are you expecting to be heard? What would change the way you vote? And is foreign policy your key issue?
I think foreign policy for me, as I'm going to keep referring to as a Muslim voter, is the most key thing now. It never has been to me before, because I never knew the effects it can have on other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But I do see the effects it has today, and I think tens of millions around the world in the West that live in the West as Muslims have the same thought process as I do right now. But I think I've always been a Labour voter. You mentioned, like, you know, many Muslims always tend to side towards Labour, and I don't think people will stop voting Labour. Because based on the conversations we've had, is that if you don't vote Labour, there's a chance the Conservatives will stay in power. Like, I don't know what an effect we can have on these two political parties, because I just see a two-party system. So no matter what you vote, whether you want to vote independent or start voting tactically, get this MP out from this constituency, nothing will happen. You're either going to have Conservatives or you're going to have the Labour Party ruling over the UK. But if there's anything that will persuade me to vote for Labour, is their position on the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And I say this why? Because we heard Keir Starmer many months ago, where he came out and he said he has no problem with
Cutting off water,
stopping the flow of aid. So he was for collective punishment. And this didn't make sense to us. And not just to Muslims, I think the majority of the British public, is that if we stand as a country and we tell the world we are like the police of the world alongside the United States of America, what humanitarian law is, what international law is, what are we doing? So I don't think we're alone as Muslims when it comes to how we will vote. If we have always voted Labour, but if there is a change in stance, I think if there is a possibility of recognition of a Palestinian state, for example, I think Muslims will rush back to Labour straight away, without voting independently or without voting tactically, because this is something that aligns with them. I don't know.
I mean, the polling does sort of match exactly what you're saying. In some sense, they're genuine. You're pretty much on it. So basically, this was a poll conducted today.
All right.
And so essentially 21% of Muslim voters said it was the most important issue for them. That's compared to just 3% of people.
I feel like it would be a lot more than that.
And the thing is, it is. You're wrong. You're right. 44% of Muslim voters said it was one of their top 5 priorities, and 86% of those polled essentially said that they would in fact vote independent if they had to over Gaza.
Right.
And that is the dramatic change, where people are seeing it through one lens. Yes, we care about all the other issues. Yes, Muslims care about NHS. They care about all the other key issues that everyone else does.
Of course.
We all live this life. We all see our purse strings tightened. We all feel the strain on our public services. We all see that. But there is something here which drives us to want to say, okay, I'm going to vote tactically and vote independent this time. I'm going to try and stick it to the Labour Party, stick it to the Conservative Party, because you're not listening to me. That is why the Green Party among Muslims is 2% up.
Yeah.
Lib Dems, a little bit up. We're seeing independents up. I mean, George Galloway in Rochdale.
Yes.
Who knows whether he retains that seat? Obviously, Rochdale.
Yeah, but it's also his endorsement to all the candidates nationwide.
Yeah. And a key example we were just mentioning was Wes Streeting.
Yeah.
He's a very senior Labour politician, shadow cabinet member. A very talented politician, very good speaker. The reality is he's facing a big threat from Leanne Mohammed. Leanne Mohammed, sorry, yeah. And she's basically running as an independent, endorsed by Galloway.
Yeah.
And it's Ilford. It's got a heavy Muslim population. He's very aware of it. And in fact, he said, basically, I don't want to take the Muslims for granted. I hear you at the local elections. He said, I hear you. I understand. I'm listening. We want to improve this.
Yeah.
And it's not, and this is my point to you. Labour have come out now and, they back a ceasefire. They've backed it for a few months now. I think January was when they came out and backed a ceasefire. But no one's listening. It feels like that initial interview with LBC turned off a lot of Muslim voters in this country.
Yeah.
I think it showed the truth of where they stand.
I think ultimately as well, like, we have an additional lens as voters in the UK or even in the US when it comes to the elections this year. Ultimately, we have one extra dimension, I think, compared to our wider society and people we meet day to day, and that is the fact that we are Muslim and we are going to be held accountable. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that we will not change the state of a nation until you change yourself. And the idea being is that we understand that ultimately we are accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this for me has been a personal shift compared to the last election, where I feel that I am going to be asked what I've done with my vote. And yeah, I can maybe de-seat a good MP or a good candidate which may challenge a party which I don't like remaining in government. But is it selfish for me to say that I'm going to vote based on what my moral consciousness says I should do? Because like you said, voting, I really care about economic issues. For me, on a domestic level, it's like the number one thing. Austerity right now and the cost of living crisis. I'm a father of 2 young children. It affects, my family, my society, my community. But ultimately, the loss of life, whether Labour or Conservatives are in government, and when it comes to their policy on Gaza, both are fairly similar. The colour of the blood that Gazan children bleed is still the same. And my vote as a Muslim cannot endorse that. That's how I feel now. And I feel that there's a lot of people who feel the same way. And for that reason, we know that voting for a party which is genocidal or endorsing genocidal acts by a far right-wing administration in Tel Aviv is criminal. Maybe not the vote, but the endorsement of it is criminal. So I think that has to be known, which kind of leads me on to the next point about protests. Yeah. So before the podcast, we were saying that, everyone, it goes without saying, has received dozens and dozens and dozens of links to petitions, email your MP, here's a draft. Yeah. The protests, of course, that we've seen. We are witnessing a genocide on social media day in, day out. How effective is protests, in your opinion? And more so, is protests a form of political engagement?
I think on the second point, firstly, it is. It really is. And I think when you're not being listened to by the government, you have no choice to some extent to go to the streets. You have to do some form of direct action, whether that's protests, sit-ins, and obviously within the boundaries of the law of the land of the place you live. And I think that's all very much merited. In terms of what has changed, I think, because I said this to you and I'll say it now, is that previously, before October the 8th, I didn't believe in protest. I fundamentally dislike people who protest.
Interesting.
And I personally just believe that what has protest ever achieved in this country? 2 million people protest against Iraq. My father, one of them. Yeah. Nothing changed. Yes. He still went into Iraq. And I think that is something that I never truly believed. What difference does it make if you walk every 2 weeks in centre of London? Who's paying attention? You're just annoying some people. That was generally my view. My view changed when I basically realised that the parties are on a different wavelength. They're not listening, and there are a bunch of people that are upset. A whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of Muslims in this country that are very upset and angry about what's happening. Yeah. And how can they show their discontent? Yes, the things they should do: email and write to your MP. Let them know, because there are a lot of MPs who basically did read the emails from their constituents, and if they were ministers, they resigned. I'm thinking Paul Bristow in Peterborough. And there were others as well who brought up the points that their constituents were making to them. There were others who marched through the centre of London, and it made headlines. People noticed, and it became a thing on TV every 2 weeks, whatever the coverage was. You did see it. And I think ultimately there was a message being made there that we're unhappy about what's going on in Gaza. We don't know how else to get this message to you. And you're clearly not listening to what we're saying in our emails, maybe. And you're clearly not shifting your policy to a way we think is reasonable to what we want. And obviously, ultimately, most people don't have the control. Not even the opposition really can control British foreign policy. We have to accept that. Yeah. But we are saying that we are dissatisfied. And that's what changed. I think if no one's listening, you have the option to protest is ultimately political engagement.
I think that's also why people are running as independents and why people are voting for independent. Because like you said, even if you don't make the change, I mean, no one's expecting us to wake up on July the 5th and have an independent prime minister or to have hundreds of independent MPs. But the idea being is that we change starts from somewhere. In 1901, when the Labour Party was formed, no one expected, they'll say, oh, it's great, very honourable that you're supporting the poor people and workers' rights and so on and so forth. But it starts from somewhere, and I think and I've told you this again, that I feel that there's a void left in the left right now, especially after Corbyn leaving the Labour Party, and I feel like there's a huge gaping hole in the left where people are struggling to voice their opinions, and it's being done right now in the form of independent runnings and through the Workers' Party and through the Green Party and all these scattered votes across different directions, where people are saying that we need somewhere to vote anywhere except the two major parties that govern the two-party system, the first past the post system that we live in. So yeah.
You mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, and it gives me some memories that when he had to step aside, I was actually upset. Because at that time, when he left his position as leader of the Labour Party, I was like, I felt like the UK lost someone that represented the UK, represented the people of the United Kingdom, because that slogan, for the many, not the few. Yeah. I saw that in Jeremy Corbyn. He was like the only one in Parliament who was willing to stand for what the people want rather than self-serve your own party or self-serve your own pockets, or however people want to say, some people are corrupted in terms of politics and stuff. But I feel like Jeremy Corbyn was like hope. He had that sort of hope, not just for Muslims, but for every single British family who wanted to have a better society to live in, who wanted to have a better educational system, who wanted to have a better welfare system, who wanted to have politics who listened to the people. Like, I felt like he was the representation of the United Kingdom in terms of the people, the citizens of the UK, and I felt like it was a great loss. And it's interesting you mentioned, by the way, you didn't believe in protest. I had that same feeling with boycotting. I don't know if I want to take the conversation this way, but when it comes to protesting, I feel like it went more, and it actually became a threat to the government. That, these people are making like a shift change in the UK. They're changing the minds of the entire United Kingdom. So what we're going to do, we're going to use the aid of media to make these protesters look like they're terrorist sympathizers, the Hamas supporters, or whether they are, what was the other word that they used? Rishi Sunak used, they go against British values. And that's something that really confuses me. What is British values? What does, you being in the political field, I want to ask, what is British values? What does Rishi Sunak mean by British values?
That's the golden question.
I mean, I think when the Prime Minister came out on Downing Street and he made that speech, he was very much referring to the victory of, obviously he was referring to the victory of George Galloway in Rochdale on that day.
Sorry, the word I was looking for was hate marches. That's what the media was playing, and the no-go zone for Jews and all these things.
So the hate marches, basically, that was obviously in reference to the protests happening every 2 weeks. And partially it was down, there is politicization of it. There is heavy politicization of it. And it in some sense, it can tap into Islamophobia. And on the other side, it can tap into anti-Semitism. That is ultimately the truth. And
just if I can add as well, the fact that we have, and we have to be real, it's so polarized, the world we're living in. Europe is polarizing, the US is polarizing, and the UK is polarizing. And we have far-right candidates who are so popular, despite milkshakes being thrown at them and all sorts of other things. And we have far-right candidates in the Netherlands and in all parts of the world as well, even in Argentina and whatnot. We've seen across the last few months the rise in popularity. And on the flip side, you've got then, in many cases, an arguably centrist government or a centrist elected official who has to pander to that ideology in order to retain any hope of re-election. So we're going to see it, and we're going to see absurd connotations like that being thrown at Muslims. And we, like I said earlier, we've not done ourselves favors as Muslims. Yes, we've engaged. Our parents have voted. Our parents have read manifestos, and our parents have petitioned and protested and so on and so forth. But have our, and I'm not literally directly blaming our elders, because obviously we are now of age to be running for office and whatnot, but are we doing enough as a community? That's the key question. And now finally we're seeing some mobilization in the form of the Muslim Vote, who are, for those who don't know, an independent organization who are trying to direct Muslims on where they should vote based on, as of recently, whether MPs are pro-Gaza or not. And as of recently has rescinded their support for Labour MPs who are pro-Gaza as well, if I'm not mistaken. So I think it's interesting that there is some mobilization for Muslims as well. However, I still think we're so far off the mark where we need to be. We don't have any, real inroads when it comes to policy making.
So do you think we should be in a position of power or influence?
I mean,
what's the word?
I'm going to bring this point to you, essentially, and it's been a point that's been made many times over. If you are not at the table, you will be on the menu. Muslims have been on the
100%.
menu. Muslims have been on the menu for as long as I can remember.
Easy scapegoat. Easy scapegoat.
Yeah, it's easy to be talked about if you're not the one helping to make policy decisions. And the truth is, when there was cases of Islamophobia last year, people like Sajid Javid, who come from Muslim ethnicity at least, they came out and they defended Muslims. And he said, honestly, this is unacceptable. Downing Street needs to act. And similarly, where there are Muslims in politics, we have seen them, at least descriptive representation-wise, being able to come out and say, hold on, this is Islamophobic. Hold on, this is targeting Muslims. Yeah. And you need people to be able to say that, because ultimately, if no one's saying it, no one's listening.
Yeah, of course.
And this brings us back to the point you're making. We are seeing candidates. We're seeing Muslim candidates stand for the Conservative Party. Yeah. In this election, we are seeing Muslim candidates stand as independents, and obviously there are many Muslim Labour MPs. Mm-hmm. And there are some Muslim Conservative MPs already. We're seeing this rise in the amount of Muslims from all parts of the spectrum. But that does lead to criticism of Muslims themselves. Why are we supporting certain parties over others? Yeah. Should our views not align suddenly with the left? Yeah. Should our views simply be off the left? Because that is where perhaps our morality suggests, or where our views go. And I basically always hold on to the idea that, we are not synonymous with one idea. We are all allowed to have different views on different things, socially liberal views, socially conservative views, as long as they are outlined with our morality. Yeah. And I think the fact there is a lot of criticism that goes towards, especially, I'm going to name him, Abbas Morali. He is running in Harrow West as a conservative. He gets a lot of criticism just based on the fact that he's running as a conservative.
Do you think it's just based on the fact that he's running as a conservative?
I think there's a significant amount of people who would hold him down straight away, whether or not they believed in what he's...
I don't disagree with you. I think he'd have a lot more sympathy. And obviously we're talking about a very specific individual, and we're trying not to endorse or critique him, because obviously he's a member of our community as well. So, but I think a lot of people would be more sympathetic to him if he was running as, with a red tie, basically. Yeah. So I agree with that. But I also think, you said something earlier, but just to come back on it, I think people are voting based on, voting on morality, but it's also whether, and like you said about Muslims who can talk about Islamophobia and so on and so forth, but at the same time it's also whether Muslims can actually achieve progress by being at the table in the first place. We did, just to give you an idea, we asked a question on Instagram, we got hundreds of responses. Do you think practicing Muslims can ever thrive in politics? 55% of people said yes, but not in the current Western system. The idea being is that in order to even get to a stage where you can make effective change and you can affect change, you have to shake the hands, wine and dine with people who are voting in favor of arms deals and are voting against ceasefires, and who are, like we said earlier, who are playing ball with far right opinions. And to get to a certain place, you need to have those conversations, and that's politics. That's why it's called politics in the first place. But then obviously everything we do has to come back to the examples that were left behind by Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Ahlul Bayt al-Muslim. And what did Amir al-Mu'mineen do, for example, when he was in a position where he was faced with absolutists who were against him and who were like causing anarchy in many ways, and who were going against the tenets of morality in many ways? He stuck with his principles, and he did not. Yeah, he played games. He played the political game, I should say, but at the same time, he didn't waver on his morals. Do you see what I mean? And many people said that he infiltrated the system and he revolutionized it himself. So whether Muslims could do that or not is the ultimate question, which is why I feel like it's such a difficult question to answer. My personal opinion is that I think Muslims have the ability to thrive in this political system, but I think it has to be done in a way which is on our own terms.
Yeah, I agree. I think ultimately, if you're not there, you just don't have a say in anything that affects you. And ultimately, you're not part of this country. If you live in the US, if you live in Canada, if you live in the UK, if you live in any Western country, you are part of that society. Yeah. Well, the rules of that society, whether you like them or not, do affect you. And the only way to have your voice heard, and I'm going to bring up an anecdotal example based on a reality that I know of. In November, I think it was, there was a certain amount of Labour shadow cabinet ministers that resigned over Gaza. And Each one of those had an hour-long meeting with Keir Starmer to explain why they were angry with the government about Gaza. And my personal view is that would they have had that meeting without being there in that room and being able to say, look, we want to serve in your government. We want to serve in your shadow cabinet. We can't do so because we just disagree so heavily on Gaza with you. And I think it's important that they had that meeting and they were in that space to have that meeting.
To get their voice heard.
Their voice heard and represent the people that they're talking about, us.
Right. Okay.
Or, the Muslim voters that elected them.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of thing matters because without it, and while the impact, again, we talk about impact as if, protests making impact, boycotts having an impact, all of these things, whether they really matter. I think if you're trying to assess impact, you may not always get where you want. Okay. The truth is
Sorry, go on.
You may not always get where you want. You may not see that you're making the endemic aim that you want. The point isn't that, though. This is where my view changed. The point isn't always about impact. The point is sometimes about being there and showing you care about the issue, showing you're supportive, whether that's voting in an election. If that's your thing, vote in the election. Don't reject the election because you're rejecting democracy. You're rejecting the opportunity, whatever you want to vote. And this is the key point. You're rejecting the opportunity to tell the parties that I disagree with you. If you want to spoil your ballot, go ahead, spoil your ballot. If you want to vote green, vote green. Vote whichever party you want to. But that is your opportunity to send a message in the most democratic of forms, where parties do analyze, they look at these things, they do realize that they've lost votes here.
Mm-hmm. I've always had the thought that Muslims should never be involved in un-Islamic governments.
Okay.
I think prior to this conversation, I think I still hold that view, but my view is changing, and I'll share in a little while why. Now, the reason why I'm saying Muslims shouldn't get involved is because there is so much you need to compromise to fit in.
Yeah.
And there is so much that you have to, just throw down the drain in terms of your Muslim and Islamic principles and values, just so that there is some leeway where you can be noticed or heard or, have an opportunity to have a position of influence or power. Is risky. What do I do as a Muslim? Let's say I now join the conservative party. As an example, I have to deal with, for example, the laws of abortion. I have to deal with, for example, the rights of LGBTQ. What do I do? It's a dilemma. As a Muslim, what do I do? But on the other hand, now you mentioned the example of if you're not on the dining table, you're pretty much on the menu, and you mentioned what do the Ahlul Bayt do, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And I got to be thinking while you two were having this talk, and I'm like, I think you're right in that aspect, because if Muslims are not in that position of influence or change, or when it comes to, being a decision maker with laws and new changes to old laws possibly, what happens if they bring a hijab ban? What happens if, for example, they stop you from practicing your faith freely, for example? Recently, like here we see locally in the UK, we see not domestic issues, not foreign policy, when it comes to, for example, praying publicly in schools. It's become a hot topic recently amongst Muslims, and now it's been part of the British conversation. Should we allow people to practice their faith freely, or should we not give them any prayer space at all? So that's one example. And then you mentioned the Ahlul Bayt, and I'm thinking, Imam Ali Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam, yes, he ruled during his caliph as fourth caliph, but during the 3 caliphates prior to his leadership role as caliph, he was still advising.
Yeah.
He was still part of answering questions. He was still part of, helping the Muslims. So he was still involved, possibly not directly in their rule politically, but he didn't shy away from it. They came to him directly, and he would answer, even if they were the leaders. He would help them and assist them. Then I was thinking, Imam Rida alayhi salam, he took the position of
Ali.
He took the position of crown prince.
Yeah,
it does come
down
to
this. What
this.
does that make you think as a Muslim? Like, yes, perhaps not take leadership roles, but you take a role where you can benefit. I'm not going to say selfishly, but benefit Muslim.
What is the purpose of politics? This is what you're talking about. What is the purpose of politics? Public service.
Yeah.
To be in the service of the public. If you're elected as you're a Muslim, you're elected, great. You're not just there to serve your Muslim constituents. You are there to serve the people, whoever they are, in your constituency, in your area. And ultimately, that is your duty. And in some sense, that is the inherent nature of public politics and public service. And that is why we elect politicians. We ask them, you need to be our voice. This is why when we have key issues, we write to them, we let them know we care about this.
Yeah.
And that is the nature of public service. And that is the nature, some politicians do forego that. Many, as we've noticed lately. But the point being is that is what the core of it is that you're serving your constituents. You're serving the people who have elected you, whoever they are.
Yeah, I think to summarize that, the points I think you guys are making is that you have to have your voice heard as Muslims, and I think it goes without saying that we undoubtedly and without hesitation really, really encourage and strongly recommend that everyone uses their vote on July the 4th in the UK for the general elections, because you have to have your voice heard, and regardless, like you said, who you're voting for or what your personal opinions are, you have to make your voice heard. And the starting point for that, at least in the current system that we live in, is to vote. And you not voting won't make you heard for not voting. It would just be a case of, how can I listen to someone who hasn't spoken in the first place? If you're in a room full of people arguing and you feel that you will be the loudest person in the room by sitting in the corner and not saying a word, you're not getting a point across, and no one's going to pay attention to the fact that you're not saying a word. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? So the analogy still stands. I now want to kind of shift towards media. Okay, so obviously we've talked about your work in mainstream media and the incredible work you do. You've met a lot of really interesting guests, a lot of people with different levels of power in government and outside. Muslims are highly frustrated with Western media. I think goes without saying. We feel demonized, we feel ostracized, and I think in many cases the marginalization that Muslims have felt, especially in the last 20 years, give or take, has meant that we now boycott mainstream media and are looking for or starting alternative forms of media, independent forms of media as well. The main question which I have is, when it comes to the way media is run as a whole, okay, how is it run? Is it decisions that are made by individuals like yourself who are day to day going through running orders and arranging bookings and speaking to guests and whatnot? Or is it very top down? And does the direction of media in the country come from executives who are, making decisions based on their own gain?
I think I would argue there's more of the it's not necessarily top down. That's where I'll start. So on my day-to-day, I'll explain you what I do. I make phone calls. I get people on to come on shows. It's really fun. And I basically,
Sounds like after work.
Yeah. It was weird to be on the other end of this for the first time. That's what I do. I call people, I get them to come on the shows, and I work out how I want to editorialize and how I want to treat a story.
Yeah.
How I want to cover it. What is the best way to do it? And I think to some extent in media, and this is being fairly open, I think there sometimes can be groupthink.
Yeah.
I think if one person said it, suddenly it's true. If one person reports it, suddenly that is the way we're going to report it. And I think partially sometimes that comes down to truthfully, it comes down to a lack of independent journalism, a lack of funding for journalists. And that's where I would leave that point. In terms of someone coming and telling me from the top, this is what you're doing, it's actually never happened. No one's told me this is what you can and can't do.
Right.
Often the way I decide to treat something is my decision alongside what the presenters I work with, my colleagues, my editors. You would often discuss it and say, look, this is what I think will work. And, you might get a yes, you may get a no. And that's the nature of every job.
Yeah.
But I've never had someone tell me, no, this is the way you're doing it. You can't do it this way. You're not allowed to discuss this. You're not allowed to mention this. And I think that's the truth. I think, there is skepticism. There is skepticism, and sometimes you look at the front page of papers over the last 10 years even. I can remember multiple front pages of the Daily Mail, for example, front pages of other papers where you see Islamophobic tropes deployed fairly frequently. I'm sure we can all think of a few. And you basically see that and you think, why is it that no one represents me in those papers? Why is it that they're targeting me? And I think partially it comes down to a lack of Muslims in the room. I think the truth is we've come back to it. If there's a lack of people there who know what you're like, you've got a bunch of people doing groupthink. So this is the view they've taken on board. This is the view they're going to report. They know who their audience is. The Daily Mail knows that it's got a 1 million plus audience. They know what that audience reads. They know what that audience engages with. They know what they're going to feed that audience. The more people you have in these institutions, the view starts to shift. they start to take on board that there are people here of that background. They're not like the way we're saying that they are. And that is over time that will change. And you are seeing it shift. But you are equally only going to see that change by working within it, as opposed to despising the system and saying, nope, they're not for me.
Yeah.
So the more Muslims that get involved in media, would this benefit us as Muslims?
I think it will. I think in my own experience, when people say certain things, and I'm going to say another rough anecdote. I was having lunch with a certain MP, and I get on with him very well, and I would consider him quite a close friend of mine. And he said to me, and this is someone I knew very well, like I said, he said to me, your people. And so I went to him and said, my people. Who do you refer to as my people? And of course, he was talking about Muslims. And I sort of made clear to them, I said, we are all one and the same in the sense that I'm Muslim, but I'm also an individual. And equally, you don't know all the other 4 million Muslims here in the UK. So don't scapegoat them like that in the way you are referring to them. And I think you can only make those points to people, and you can only make that in a way that if they know you. You need to make people know you. You need to make people realize that you exist. You're not just numbers on a page. You're not only people write about from the top down view. You need to be there when they're writing that story about you.
So for the many youth at home who are maybe disenfranchised and really, really apathetic from the state of politics and even the state of media, your advice would be to engage rather than to disengage, because it's more beneficial to engage when you are frustrated than to not.
Yeah, in some sense, I'm quite happy to see the vast majority of peace-loving Muslims, like we are, engaging in the system in the way they know how, and that's only happened since October the 8th. There's a fact in there. I think if you want to keep engaging, the best thing to do is actually get involved. Don't just protest. Write to your MP. Speak to your MP. Learn about what they're doing. Most MPs are quite open to getting to know you to something, and it will only benefit you. So get to know them, build up relationships, tell them what your concerns are, and build up that relationship, because only through that can you really have your voice represented in Parliament. Only through that will people listen to what you say. And I think that's what matters. And
when it comes to getting involved in the media, it's hard to get into the media. I had a brief stint at the beginning of my career. A lot of friends I know maybe interned or shadowed or did work experience in the media, mainstream media, for a bit as well. At least I found that getting into media when I was younger was difficult, and for you and I, we both had the same kind of people, all the same people in some cases, who helped us get into certain roles. If you don't have that, how do you pursue it? And what advice would you have to someone who is interested in pursuing a career in media?
I mean, I think we probably both went through the similar struggles, and the struggle being is that there's no one like me. You look at the TV, you don't see anyone like you. You don't see anyone with a similar background. You think with a similar name, barely a similar color. That's somewhat changed these days. But now you look on TV and there are people more like you, and descriptive, like we've been talking about, matters, descriptive representation. Now, in terms of getting involved, it's, start inquiring in your local newsrooms. Everyone has a local paper. Give them a call and say, look, I just want to come in, see what it's like. That's where I started. Just gave them a call, said, look, I want to come in for a few days work experience. I did 48 hours of work experience. And I did probably about 10 of those over the course of about 2 to 3 years. Unpaid, all of them. And that's how I managed to progress one step by step to eventually, starting to make some progress into this industry. So it's not easy.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I don't come with the contacts in the world. I didn't come with that. I didn't come with the sort of silver spoon contacts that some people may have, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
But it's being willing, and you need to just start engaging, and people are more than willing to help you. Ultimately, you just have to take that first initial, more than anything, brave step. And your conceptions of the media, like mine, did shift from where they were at the start to where they are now.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So there isn't like a narrative as we all have in our minds. Perhaps there is. No, but you're very right. I mean, it's a very easy thing to say. Just blame the media and we're being misrepresented and things like. I think we do need to get more involved, and I think we are seeing a rise of this, especially also now, given what happened on the 7th of October and beyond until today. And we have one example like I think Brother Mehdi Hassan. It's a big example of how he has made shockwaves in the media world, especially across the pond and across the Atlantic in the USA. Now he's got his own brand, his own news channel, and people are tuning in, and people are watching, and he has provided an alternative. I was someone who used to always read BBC News, keep up with the news, but the way I saw they were portraying what's happening in the Middle East, I knew it was majority, not full on lies, but just misrepresentation of the truth. So I needed an alternative, and I haven't opened the BBC News app, I think, for over 4 months now.
Yeah.
Because if there are alternatives, if Muslims are going into this field, there will be an opportunity where we will be heard, we will be represented, and inshallah we will be a faith where we can inspire people to come towards Islam. Because the media at the moment, I would say, scares a lot of people. Like, let's go back to the USA. I remember a very famous interview with then President Donald J. Trump, when he told the host of the interview that Islam has a problem with us.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this point, and it went viral, and everyone was like, you know what? He's right. Muslims do have a problem with us. Muslims do have a problem with the West. And I think if we can have our own outlets, we can actually present the truth as it truly is.
And I think just to add to that as well, it goes to show why funding is needed in media, and that's why everyone at home should support our sponsor, Thaqalain Media. So check out what they're doing, guys. They're doing incredible work. Support them. They're doing incredible. You can visit them, download the app Thaqalain Media, and go to the support tab on the bottom.
This
right
was
as
an
well.
organic plug.
Yeah, it was organic.
It wasn't
completely
planted.
organic. But no, it's really important because look, you talked about Mehdi Hassan and Zeteo, and although Mehdi Hassan and Zeteo came about kind of in a good way because his airtime got cut, and obviously he wanted to speak on such a critical time.
Yes.
He actually came out and he'd probably done more benefit than he thought he would have had he stayed in his mainstream media role. And the idea being is that he's now being able to give the airtime to issues that he thinks deserve it. And he's representing, of course, a fabric of society or ideology which he feels hasn't been heard enough. And he's now galvanized like-minded people in different industries, whether they're politicians or activists or journalists or whatever they might be, and allowed them to speak their thoughts on centrally, of course, Gaza, but obviously the US elections and otherwise as well, especially somewhat here and there with the UK as well. But that's a classic example of why independent media also needs support. I strongly believe, whether that's After Maghrib, whether it's Thaqalain, and obviously we are a different form of media because we're providing a form of entertainment or religious upliftment or whatever you want to call it. But in terms of journalism as well, we have to back it. I heard I'm just gonna say, I know it's obviously a separate conversation, but say Jawad Qazwini had a podcast with MyCast last week. Shout out to them, incredible podcast. But he mentioned on this podcast, he said that our institutions should think tactically about how we spend our money, because in many ways our organizations will spend hundreds and thousands of pounds every Ramadan, for example, making rice and curry and shawarma and this and that, when we can reinvest that money in. And he used the example of social media. I would even go further and say, we can invest into lobbying and think tanks, or we can pull money together for training for young and up-and-coming British or whatever American teenage Muslims who are showing an interest in media or in mainstream politics but don't have the training necessarily, or maybe lack the qualities or even the funding to get to and from places of work and whatnot, but supporting them, university grants, scholarships, so on and so forth. But investment on a grassroots level in the Muslim communities, we're way behind on that. We're way behind. And there's so many other communities, without naming them, other religious communities, which put so much emphasis on this, and as a result, now dominate certain circles. Do you see what I'm saying? And when it comes to especially Shia Islam, we believe we have the answers. We talk about Imam al-Hussein, and we talk about quality over quantity and doing the right thing and standing against oppression and so on and so forth. And yeah, we love to make our voices heard with banners and placards on protests because we believe in rebellion and revolution and standing up for the right thing. But on a more gradual level, on a longer term level, we don't do that through engagement, and that's a huge flaw which we have. And I'm sorry to say, I feel like that falls on us because we end up supporting causes which are worthy causes but are then saturated basically, or receiving too much support maybe in some cases, and not directing our funds elsewhere. maybe that comes from a leadership perspective. I'm not directing us as donors maybe in the right way, but it just comes back to literacy and understanding like where we're slacking. So yeah, it's a much broader conversation, I think, in terms of the growth and the development and the thriving of Muslims in society, be it media or politics or otherwise. But it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts for people who are maybe now, hopefully by this point in the podcast, like a bit more convinced to vote in the election, or any last comments?
I think I would encourage basically all brothers and sisters. You've heard what we have to say here. You've heard. I've brought everyone around. We're all on my page now. We're all saying the same thing. But I think what needs to happen is on July the 4th.
That's what makes a good politician.
Yeah. Maybe it's training. You need on July the 4th. The main thing is people just need to go out there, and you've made your voices heard on the streets every Saturday. A great deal of you. The main thing you need to do is just go out there and put a check in any box, whichever box you want. But that is the way to get started. And then anything further you want to do, there are plenty of ways to go out and do that. And that we've discussed them on the podcast. Yeah.
Thank you, Aliraza. I really, really, really appreciate having you on. And I think you will agree, Sid, we learned a lot.
We did. I did. I know some opinions I held have changed. So well done. And thank you for enlightening us and allowing, I think, the audience, I mean myself, to learn more about politics.
Absolutely.
Shukran.
Guys, next week we have a really fascinating conversation with a guest I think you'll all be very interested by, someone who's actually not a Muslim, and who's exploring Islam for the first time, and he's coming all the way down to London to engage with us. He's extremely well known online, so that's not a podcast you want to miss. Inshallah, we're recording it in the next few days, so let's just pray it actually goes ahead and we manage to get him on. But make sure you tune in next week. Aliraza, thanks once again. Make sure you subscribe, guys, to After Maghrib, and follow us on all social media. We will be back next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.